Good afternoon. Today I'll be comparing the Canon 1DX Mark II to the Canon 5D SR. Now I know they're both different cameras designed for different uses, but since I've got them with me, why not do a quick test? Now let's delve straight into a bit of history. Now the Canon 5DS and the 5DSR both were released in early 2015, not as a replacement, but alongside the Canon 5D Mark III. Now, the difference between the 5DS and the 5DSR, both come equipped with a 50 megapixel sensor. However, the 5DSR, standing for resolution, does not have a low pass filter, thus enhancing the detail it captures. However, it does increase the risk of moire patterns being formed. Now let's go above and into the 1D flagship series. The Canon 1DX Mark II was released as a replacement to the 1DX in early 2016. Now these two cameras are designed for two different purposes. The Canon 5D SR being designed mainly for studio work, whilst the 1DX Mark II designed mainly for professional sports photographers or professional wildlife photographers. Now let's start off with some basic comparisons. Megapixels, the 5DSR has 15 megapixels, whilst the 1DX Mark II has 20 megapixels. Next up, the pixel size. That is how big each pixel is within the sensor. The pixel size in the 5DSR is 4.13 microns versus 6.54 microns on the 1DX Mark II. Now the dynamic range. The dynamic range on the 5DSR is 12.4 stops versus 13.5 stops on the 1DX. Simply because the 1DX has a bigger sensor, it can accommodate for a greater range. Now shutter rate. So on the 5DSR, you have 5 frames per second versus 14 frames per second in the 1DX Mark II, which can go up to 16 frames per second in live view. ISO range. Now here's a stunner. The ISO starts off at 100 and goes all the way up to 6400, whilst on the 1DX Mark II, it starts off at a base of 100 and goes all the way up to 51200. Now that's huge. Let's take a look at a few scenarios and see which camera would be best for each scenario. With landscape, you would choose a 5DSR over the 1DX. Why? Because of the 50 megapixel sensor, you will be able to capture fine details, and generally speaking, landscape photos are taken for prints or for large scale printing, so you would need that actual detail, and the 5DSR is designed for that use. However, the 1DX Mark II does have a greater dynamic range, so when it comes to capturing a scene with a lot of colors, the 1DX Mark II does excel in that area. So whilst I will say the 5DSR is perfect, the 1DX Mark II is also just as good in terms of color but not detail. Next up, let's have a look at wildlife. With wildlife, you want to capture every moment, and for that I would say the 1DX Mark II wins, simply because it has a better autofocus system and it has 14 frames per second versus 5 frames per second. The 1DX Mark II does have a big advantage over the 5DSR. However, if you have very cooperative animals, for example turtles, then the 5DSR is perfect because you can get high resolution pictures of turtles without the risk of losing focus. Another advantage of the 1DX Mark II, it has built-in GPS, so when you are in the field taking photos, you'll be able to geotag your photos and pinpoint where these photos were taken, making it easier to review and post-process photos. Let's have a look at portraits. Now with portraits, depends on who your client is. If you were printing portraits on magazines, the 1DX Mark II is perfect because of its dynamic range. Or if you're capturing portraits to be printed on a side of a building or on billboards, then the 5DSR is perfect for you. I focused a lot on Astro, and so I did put in a good amount of effort in capturing Astro photos. With Astro, I really had a tie over here. I did not know which one to choose. Let's take a quick look at two photos captured at 24mm ISO 800 with a single 5-minute exposure. Now these two photos are of the Milky Way core, so both of these pictures are raw. Now let's take a quick look at editing these pictures. Now when I did edit these two pictures, I had greater freedom on the 1DX Mark II, simply because it captured a lot more information. The 1DX Mark II was able to capture a whole lot of information, especially with the shadows, in particular the dark nebula, the dark clouds within the galactic core. Whilst the 5DSR actually captured a lot of detail. So when you zoom into these two images, the 5D SLR definitely wins. Simply stunning with the amount of detail it can capture in the stars. Why was I stumped? Simply because when it came to printing, when I did a large scale printing, I eventually chose the 5D SR simply because it had much more detail. So when you do a large scale printing, the detail does stick out and it does look beautiful. Whereas on a 1DX, it won't be as clear as the 5D SR. In conclusion, both these cameras are fantastic cameras. The 1DX Mark II has an amazing autofocus system, amazing frame rate at 14 frames per second, and has an amazing low light sensor. The 5D SR is another beautiful camera with stunning details, and the file sizes are huge. However, I did learn that the 5D SR is not so forgiving when it comes to taking pictures. You really have to know your game, and your skill set is put to test with capturing images on the 5D SR, simply because each pixel size is so small. It doesn't capture that whole range of information, meaning you will have to get your picture perfectly exposed from the get-go. Whereas with the 1DX Mark II, you always have that room to play with in post-production. Do note that whilst cameras are good and whilst each camera serves a purpose, eventually it's down to the lens you choose. Glass is very important, so when you get good glass, you get good images. You can get amazing images on the 1DX provided you put a good glass on it. Each camera is unique, each camera serves its own purpose, and it's up to you. I hope you found this video interesting. Leave a comment. Happy shooting!